You would know by now that Phil and myself notified the Melbourne Rebels staff and playing group that the participation licence to participate in the 2025 Super Rugby season was not granted to the consortium based on a lack of detail and transparency that we were provided recently. So we've had to make the very difficult decision that the men's Rebels team, and I note that it's only the men's team that we're making the decision on, the women's Rebels team will continue to assess that separately, and we'll continue to work with the Victorian Rugby Union in ensuring the delivery of the important community programs. This is a very difficult day for rugby, and it's a very difficult day for rugby fans in Melbourne, a very difficult day for the fans, the players and the staff, but we felt that we had to get to a decision. We've been waiting for some time to allow the consortium to get as much information and as much detailed and accurate information to us to make a decision. That wasn't forthcoming to the satisfaction of what we would deem a reasonable level of risk. So, as I said, we've had to make that decision today for the 2025 season for the men's super season only.
I'll just add a few other comments. Post the Rebels entering voluntary administration, we've been working on three different scenarios. The first scenario for 2025 would be Rugby Australia supporting the Melbourne Rebels in the 2025 season. The second scenario was a reduction of teams, which would see the Melbourne Rebels no longer participate in the 2025 season. And then the third scenario was the consortium that would come in and fund the Rebels going forward. We've given an enormous amount of time to that consortium to come forward with information. We split that information into five different requests for information. The first one being financial viability, the second one being governance and risk, the third being commercial strategy, the fourth being high performance, and the fifth being growth of the game. We finally got the information, or some of the information that we'd requested middle of last week in a data room. We've analysed that information at great lengths, and then we met with one member of the consortium earlier this week, again giving the consortium every possible opportunity to put forward a compelling case to support the Melbourne Rebels in 2025. As Daniel said, this is the men's 15 team in the Super Rugby Pacific for 2025. We are absolutely committed to rugby in Victoria. So all our commitment into the community game, into our pathways, into the women's pathways, we are committed to rugby in Victoria, and we'll continue that commitment, and we look forward to working with, as Daniel said, Rugby Victoria, Visit Victoria and the Victorian Government in investing in rugby in Victoria. Thank you.
Any questions?
How damaging is this to rugby union's brand in Victoria? You say you're committed to it, but is there any coming back for the Super Rugby team in this state?
Yeah, so we've got an open mind. I think we've been put under enormous pressure on the timeline that we need to work to in terms of giving players certainty into their futures and staff certainty into their futures. Let's be clear, the administrator made all the employees of management redundant the day that they took over. We stood up the Rebels for 2024. We employed 83% of the Rebels management staff. The relationship we have with the Players Association through the collective bargaining agreement ensured that the players were protected. So Rugby Australia has stood up the Melbourne Rebels in 2024, and it was important for us to do that. Equally, it was important for us to give the consortium time to put a compelling position forward. In terms of the reputation of rugby in Victoria, we see strong growth in the community game. Certainly the performance of the Rebels in 2024 going through to the finals is pleasing, and the growth of the women's game is also pleasing. So it is not an ideal situation having to reduce remove the Rebels from participating in Super Rugby Pacific. However, I'll keep coming back to the fact that we have limited resources, we have limited finances, and we need to invest in the game that's going to drive the greatest connection to community as well as uplifting participation. And we're committed to that. And as I said, we're committed to working with the Victorian Government to drive activity across the state.
Phil, how much does the Rebels cost you this season? So when they went flat and you've taken over 80% of their payroll, what's the bill for Rugby Australia?
Again, it's obviously some of the financial modelling that we've gone through and looking forward into 2025, but it's in excess of $6 million.
And you've got a loan with or a product deal with PEP, that was $80 million, you have to pay $3 million on that to begin with. What's that down to now? Is Rugby Australia a going concern into the future?
Yeah, well, technically it is, yes. And I've talked again and socialised this quite broadly in the fact that the Lions tour and the Home Rugby World Cup in 27 and 29 with the women's are critical revenue events for rugby in Australia. As you say, we've drawn a fairly significant amount of the $80 million debt facility. And this is about stabilising the game, and the way that we think about the finances of the game is living within our means. And when we think about the revenue opportunity in the Lions, ideally we pay down all the debt. We then go into a new broadcast cycle in 2026, which will allow us hopefully to reset the economics of the game, and we get into a sustainable model going forward from 26 through the next broadcast cycle to 2030, which will then allow us to protect and preserve and quarantine the revenue that we get from the Rugby World Cups, so that we can actually set up a future fund that allows us to invest into the community game.
And with the World Cup, will that be in Melbourne? Will the semi-finals and the final be in Melbourne? Is that still a deal that's on the table?
Yeah, so we're as I said, we're very committed to working with Visit Victoria, the Victorian Government. International rugby has been very, very successful in Victoria for a long, long time, and we're confident it will continue to be that way.
And without the Rebels next year, what does it mean for the TV deal? Are you going to run the TV deal? What happens with that with Nine?
Yeah, so we've been very fortunate, and I think one of the compelling propositions of rugby is its international nature. So it's not just about Nine, it's also about other broadcasters, Sky New Zealand, as well as our global partners. And so we've worked through the impact of a reduction of teams. We deliver 91 games in its current format, and we're working through with New Zealand on what 2025 would look like with 11 teams. But it would look like probably about 83 to 84 games. So clearly reduction in the number of games in the early modelling. However, it may be a longer season. So there's really constructive partnership conversations occurring with New Zealand Rugby as well as with other broadcasters around the world.
And just to reiterate, something that might be a little bit different in our sport and also in this country, and one of the reasons why financial viability is so important is when we do a broadcast deal, it's owned between Australian Rugby and New Zealand Rugby. So we're on the hook. So if we don't deliver, if a team doesn't deliver, then Rugby Australia is in the firing line. And also through our collective bargaining agreement, we're on the hook to make sure we continue to pay the players. And that doesn't exist in most other sports or in most other rugby countries. So that's why we have to be sure that there is very little risk with the position that we're in, that there is very, very little risk that's being put forward. And what has been put forward carries significant risk.
Are you disappointed? In your statement earlier today, you said that the club may have been trading insolvent for some time. That was in the administrative report. Are you disappointed with the way the Melbourne Rebels have been handled by the board of directors?
Yes. Very disappointed. I think they've let rugby stakeholders in Victoria down and rugby stakeholders broadly. And whilst this is not a crack at people individually or as people, they're people who love rugby, we are now 6 years away from where Rugby Australia paid $13.8 million towards Rebels debts back in 2017 and gave an additional $6 million of funding. There's been tens of millions of dollars that has been spent on this franchise over and above other Super Rugby clubs. And to be $23 million in debt again 6 years later, yes, we're disappointed.
How How much have they asked in the meeting this week for Australia to pay the tax bill? Because they're on the book personally for $7.8 million, the directors and affiliates.
Yeah, that's confidential. We can't share that information, I'm sorry.
The consortium announced in their statement that they're moving ahead with their court action. What's Rugby Australia's response?
Our response is every dollar spent on lawyers is money not spent on rugby and the community game and the programs and other Super Rugby clubs. It is not our preference. We also have claims against those directors, those former directors. If they want to continue to go down that, then there's only so many times you can continue to be threatened without pushing back.
What are the claims against the directors?
That they were continued to take money whilst they were allegedly trading insolvent.
Was this related to the payroll, the tax that you claim was misappropriated or misused?
That's part of claims, and we've got several claims. We don't need to disclose in this environment, but as Daniel said, every dollar that we spend in court is a dollar that doesn't get invested into the game of rugby around Australia, and it's disappointing that if that is the path it goes down, then those individuals that have had the best interests of rugby at mind choose to damage the game going down that path.
No, and we're not interested in taking money out of much needed money out of the game to pay people's personal debts from direct penalty notices.
How worried are you about the litigation?
It's been a threat that's from before they even went into voluntary administration. The first threat was fine, and it's been ongoing since. So we've become very accustomed to that's the modus operandi of some of the people involved.
In terms of the lack of detail that you say the consortium didn't provide, was there a reason that they gave for not disclosing who were the key advisors?
Yeah, that's a question for them. It's hard to answer that. I mean, the information at best, what I could say was embryonic and very underdeveloped. We asked for information on who the consortium was. That still has not been forthcoming. We told them that it was critical in terms of the decision that we would need to shortly make, that we understood the identities of the people. We need to understand the risk around the money that they say that they have raised. But again, this has been shared with the media before us. And it was clear through even their very ambitious financial modelling that there would need to be a very high risk of RA again stepping in to have to contribute large amounts of money to keep the club going, and very ambitious targets around crowds and corporate hospitality and all the other non-revenue lines or non-RA revenue lines. So it's simply at the point where we can't, it's not at a point that any reasonable governing body could issue a licence based on the information that we've provided.
And have they given a reason for why they couldn't disclose the securing of that $18 million funding or documentation?
No, that's a question for them. They asked us to sign a document that we wouldn't disclose the information. We asked or stated to them that this should be able to stand up in the court of public opinion, and nothing should be sacred.
The only thing I'll add to that, sorry Melissa, is there may be more information that comes forward in the coming days, weeks, months. What I made very clear in the engagement with a consortium member and the presentation this week is that we will make a decision with the information that we have on hand, and we've given the consortium since the end of January to give us that information, and clearly the information that went into the data room last week and then the presentation that we received earlier this week, we've absorbed that and we've made a decision on the information that we had in front of us.
And we wanted this to succeed. We've given this so-called consortium or unidentified consortium a long time to give us the information and to give us, I guess, the security that we required. But it got to a point where we now have to make decisions, and we've been criticised for taking too long to make the decision. So we had to make a decision around the planning for 2025, and there's a lot of people who are going to be impacted by this and are impacted by this, including the rest of rugby outside of Victoria and the other Super Rugby clubs. So we had to give the players, the staff certainty, and we couldn't wait any longer. And if there is more information that comes to light, if there is more transparency in the future, then the door is never shut. We would like for there to be more money coming into the game, but based on the evidence or the information we've been given, it's not at a stage that we can make a decision for 2025 right now.
I appreciate that you two are fairly new in your positions, but sort of how did it come to this? Like, does Rugby Australia accept some responsibility for allowing the club to get into such debt?
Well, I think this is, we've been saying for a little while that clubs need to live within their means, and it's an unusual dynamic that the governing body is on the hook for certain amounts of the costs that go associated with that. When the Super Rugby broadcast agreement was finalised, and it was as a point in time where the product had been in decline for some time. Now what that means is you then need to readjust your cost base, and whilst we are a governing body, we don't sit in the clubs and tell them what to do. We say you are, based on the value of the broadcast, how the broadcasters have determined the value, you get a distribution of that. And we distribute more than 100% of what we receive in that regard. It's no different to you move jobs and your pay goes backwards, you need to readjust your budget. And these clubs needed to do that, and the Rebels needed to do that.
But this has been obviously a concern for the last few years. I mean, didn't you look at financial reports and see that where they were headed?
The information that was provided wasn't complete or provided at all of the times that we would have liked, but they had a plan, and we were talking to them at a stage when we knew, because it was nowhere near the level that it ended up being, and they had a plan and they were dealing with that, and we had confidence at the time that they had it under control and that they had the means to be able to continue to pay their bills. And then that changed. We weren't aware that they received the DPNs from the Australian Tax Office until well after that had occurred. So there was a gap in the communications there that was being provided.
It seems particularly brutal that, you know, they're just about to get on a plane to go to Fiji. They've got their first final next week. So what's your thoughts around the timing of the news?
No, look, I think, yeah, there's no good time for this. I think that I was very clear when the Rebels went into voluntary administration that we would make a decision as quickly as we possibly could with all the appropriate information that we required. We received that information last week. We had a presentation this week. We then analysed all the information and we made the decision as quickly as we could to give certainty to players and staff. And I think that's a fair and reasonable thing to do. One element that I think under new leadership, talk about new leadership, is that we do what we say we're going to do, and we act with integrity. And we always said that once we had the information on hand, we will make a decision and an educated decision as quickly as we possibly could. We've done that. I think it's a good time, in terms of the performance of the Rebels going into a tough game in Fiji and then their first finals ever. So I think that we've given certainty, players have certainty, staff have certainty, and now that we hope they go forward and succeed.
I think the key thing was there is no good time, and once these decisions are made, generally it's hard to keep it under wraps. And we had committed to the players and the staff that we would share that information with them as soon as we arrived at that decision. If we were to do it next week leading into a final, their first final, I think that would have been worse. And then to hold off another week after that, after Super Rugby potentially was over, or whether they were through to another final, then you're just kicking the can down the road, and you just run out of runway. And we've tried to give this, as I said before, as much time as we possibly could, because we wanted this to work. We wanted this consortium to come forward with a plan that would blow our minds, that would put rugby on a great footing leading into some of the big events that we have in our pipeline with the British Lions next year, Men's World Cup, then a Women's World Cup. We're excited, and we thought this might actually be something that the game needs, but based on where we sit right now and the information that's been provided and the lack of transparency around some of the key questions that we asked, we have to make this decision now. We couldn't wait any longer.
What was some of the feedback like this morning in the room?
No, look, I think, very pleased that we were able to get face-to-face with the players and staff. We went through, like we have throughout the whole process, what our decision framework was to get to the decision that we made. And I think that the players and staff feel that we've run a fair process and feedback. Again, without having spoken individually to the players, I think that the players and staff hopefully feel like we've run a thorough process to get to an outcome as quickly as we could.
I think one of the important things is the human element in this. There's a lot of lives impacted. And we've been having these, as Phil touched on a couple of weeks ago. We had Peter Horn, Justin Harrison from Rupert down there. They've been working with the team around scenario planning that just in case this doesn't happen. Our head of HR is down there today to work with the players and to, to provide any support that we're able to provide the players and their families and the staff and their families. And having been through something similar myself a long time ago, there's a few tears, and it's hard work, and we don't underestimate the impact that's going to have on people's lives.
What happens to the players' outstanding contracts if you don't put it to one if they can't find new clubs?
Yeah, so that's again, one of the great protections within the collective bargaining agreement we have with the Rugby Union Players Association is that we've stood behind all the player contracts that are on foot, and we continue to do that within the agreement, the collective bargaining agreement. So essentially, we fund all commitments, which is part to the cost that you talked to earlier. We fund all commitments to players. There's players that have contracts through to 2025, which we've worked through, depth charts and looking at cohesion across other Super Rugby clubs and salary cap within other Super Rugby clubs to work out where the best landing club could be. Equally, you've got players who are off contract that will go through normal contract negotiations around what 25 and beyond looks like.
And you'll be saving some costs by not having the Rebels on your books going forward. What are you going to do with that money?
So again, through the participation deed, we pass through $3.8 million. As to, we just talked through the financial challenges of the game. We'll have analysis of where that money and those funds should go. My point earlier around funding broader rugby in Victoria is important in the pathways. However, it is a cost that allows us to invest elsewhere.
Can the other clubs hope to have an increase in their distributions going forward now that the Rebels no longer exist?
Look, I think that again, depending on the modelling and how the end impact of the finances look, that's one of the considerations that we'll consider.
Is the problem in Victoria, or was it the directors? Could a rugby club survive in Victoria if it was under better management?
It's a good question. Look, it's the second in a row that has got to a similar position. And I know that the Melbourne Storm struggled for a long time as well, even with a lot more success. I guess the Rebels, up until recently, hadn't had that on-field success. I think they were running at about 32% win ratio, which in a very challenging market with such a strong competitor as the AFL, it does make it very difficult. But I do think there are ways. There are ways that you don't have to spend as much money as you spend. And there are plenty of instances of clubs who perform well without spending the most amount of money. So there are always decisions that they could make, but I think there are certain challenges in each market that you go to, and that's one here.
Can you explain how the administration of a women's team would work, especially if it's a Rebels women's team, just given I guess there's not that faith to grant the men's licence in the current consortium? How would it work in terms of resourcing, etc.?
Yeah, very similar to how it worked in 2024. We've invested an increased investment in women's rugby in Australia by 61%. The Super Rugby contracts have gone up, as well as obviously the Wallaroo investment. So we would work with the high performance team to ensure they've got the best possible environment to succeed, which is one of the considerations. To your point, the lease does run out. The lease that Rugby Australia has been paying since the club went into administration at the end of January, that runs out at the end of the Super Rugby season. So training facilities, the right environment, medical and strength and conditioning support, all of the support that would allow athletes to perform at their best is a consideration that we need to ensure occurs.
Yeah, and the other body we'd work closely with is Rugby Victoria. So there is certainly some experience in that administration around running programs.
So would you consider, I guess, a change of management or granting another Melbourne licence, for example, rather than having it come under the Rebels?
And again, another consideration. I mean, we could run the women's program centrally. Whatever's the most efficient and sensible path forward to maximise performance as well as have a sensible economic outcome.
The statement pointed to, they made the accusation that Rugby Australia is hypocritical because they have provided millions of dollars to the Waratahs. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's a very different situation. The Waratahs didn't bring across any debt and actually had money in the bank. And so it's a very different scenario. And as I say, we're talking about a team who over 6 years there's been a significant overinvestment, and the Waratahs weren't in that same position. Now that doesn't mean that the Waratahs at this point in time won't cost Rugby Australia some money from the integration. It will, but we see a path forward over the next couple of years to where that'll not only get to a cost neutral scenario. We think the commercial, given that it's the second biggest brand behind the Wallabies, we think it can get to a position where it's actually a profit-making venture. And so the directors or the board of the Waratahs at that time saw that opportunity to integrate. So it's very different scenarios.
Are there any other changes or anything to any other clubs, or is this sort of limited to the Rebel? And separately, you touched on the fixturing for next year. Could they potentially play each other with the 11 clubs play 20 games, up to 20 games?
Yeah, we're working through the modelling. Obviously, we want to keep as many games in the competition as we can. Obviously, delivered 91. Well, we'll deliver 91 this year. So we're just working through scheduling. There's different, again, complexities across collective bargaining agreements with New Zealand Rugby around availability of All Blacks as well. So we want to make sure you keep integrity in the competition and ensure that we're providing enough games. So it's not a confirmed position yet, but it'll be a position that we land on with New Zealand.
Was playing games away from Amy Park as a cost saver ever a realistic proposition? The Western United venue had been mentioned even by their chairman as a potential option. Yeah, so when the Rebels entered voluntary administration and we delivered the season and we're looking at delivering games, we looked at Melbourne and where there were rectangular field options, and there aren't any really outside of Melbourne Olympic Park or Amy Park. We've been out to Tarnee, so we've been out there. We've looked at the area where the proposed development will be, the new stadium. So we've been through every piece of detail of Western Melbourne and also Tarnee. And the reality is there's limited options that meet broadcast requirements in Melbourne. So there's a lot of limitations with rectangular sport, which is why we've been playing the games this year at Amy Park. So the training facility where they're staging A-League games now wouldn't meet your broadcast standard?
That's one of the pieces that we went through with the broadcast. It obviously meets the broadcasting standards of the A-League.
I think as part of the financial modelling, the cost savings were put forward in some of the financial modelling that they had done and put forward. As I touched on earlier, we felt that there still was a huge amount of risk and that the numbers presented in that financial modelling were very risky, and that risk, as I touched on earlier, falls back to Rugby Australia if they fall short.
Is that the financial modelling done by a
Yes, I believe so.
Did RA speak to the state government about potentially hiking their contribution to the Rebels, their funding, or to Rugby Australia? Were they responsive at all to the conversation?
We and I have had conversations with members of the Victorian government. They reiterated to me that they would like the Rebels to exist. They would like the Rebels. It's important to the sporting landscape. At no time did they offer to underwrite or contribute a larger amount of money toward the Rebels.
Final question?
Yeah, is that a point of frustration, though? What you just said, at no time they offered to?
No, because, I mean, we would love to get more money from any source, but it's not a frustration because we know how, we've got to make decisions around what's best for rugby. They have to make decisions around what's best for the people of Victoria, and I know that if they make a certain decision in one sport, then every other sport will be lining up, unless it's a very different prospect. So, no, certainly not a frustration, and they've been very supportive of rugby down here. And, and only, I think a year or two ago, we had 85,000 at the MCG for the Bledisloe, and the economic impact that those big events can bring to Victoria, are a standalone proposition. So no, there's no frustration there at all.
All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.